at the end of World War II, in constant dollars, these are today's dollars, the federal deficit was $2.67 trillion. And that is after a decade of depression and unemployment and then 5 years of all-out warfare. And our federal deficit in today's dollars was $2.67 trillion. By 1980, when Ronald Reagan took over, the deficit had dropped to, and again, constant dollars, $1.8 trillion. So the economy had done well. We actually paid down the deficit. By the time Reagan and Bush were done, the deficit was at $5 trillion. It had almost tripled in the 12 years of the Reagan-Bush administration. By the end of the Clinton administration, it was still just about $5 trillion. When George W. Bush took over, the deficit rose from $5 trillion to about $7 trillion. He added another $2 trillion to it. So 2 years ago, or a little over a year ago, it was sitting at $7 trillion. It is now $11.7 trillion. It has almost 50% within a year. It is scheduled to go up $1 trillion a year for the next 10 years. By 2020, the federal deficit, the federal debt, will be over $20 trillion. It's tough for people to understand what that means, but in simple terms, if you were a banker looking at a business who had a track record like that, you'd shut it down immediately. We're broke. We're going to be broke. If the federal government has to keep going to the marketplace to finance that debt, eventually interest rates are going to get so high that it's going to be like Argentina was during the Perón administration. We'll have to take wheelbarrows full of money to go to get groceries for our weekly diets. It'll be absolutely unbelievable. So if we don't address these issues now, everything we've worked for, everything that our parents sacrificed for, got us through World War II for, will be for naught, because the United States will be a second-rate country, begging for credit from other countries of the world and not sure that we're going to get it. And there's already indications of that. This economy, we've been through a tough year. There's no indication that we're coming out of this thing in the next year or 2 years. It's going to be a slow upward crawl out of this. But we're already seeing indications that inflation is beginning to come back, and that the cost of debt is starting to come back. If we could be looking at the Carter administration, where you had stagflation, if you remember that, they talked about that, a stagnant economy and inflation in double digits, we could be seeing that in steroids for the next 10 or 15 years. Nobody wants to go through that again. In addition to that, I mean, everybody's tired of the culture in Washington. We have to transform what's happening in Washington, D.C. We've got to get the professional career politicians out of there. We've got to get the lobbyists out of there. We've got to get the lawyers out of there. We don't need any more lawyers and career politicians in Washington, D.C. Our framers never intended that it would be like that. When they didn't put term limits in the Constitution for one simple reason. They didn't think anybody would want that job for more than 1 or 2 terms. They envisioned the citizen congressman, somebody that would work that would establish himself, build a career, build a farm, and so forth, and then toward the end of his career, he would decide to give something back by serving in public service. Washington was very clear about that. That's why he established the 2-term tradition for the presidency. He said that we don't want career politicians. Nobody envisioned it was going to be the way it is now. Why is it the way it is now? Simple: money. You look at what somebody can make if they get into Congress, the way all these political wannabes are, these guys that can't make it in business and are terrible lawyers. They decide, well, let's get a public job, let's get into Congress. And if they can stay in Congress for as long as these guys have been there, they come out worth a lot of money. Bill Clinton never had a real job in his life. All he ever was a politician. He served through Arkansas and as the President of the United States. how much should for somebody that was poor, I mean, we all know Clinton's background, how much would you think that somebody that was in public service his whole life, even though he was the president, could be worth? $100 million? That's why they're in there, because the Clintons are worth $100 million. So if we don't break this culture, this Washington culture of greed and backslapping now, we're never going to be able to do it. We've got to get the career politicians out of there. In 1994, we had the Contract with America guys. The conditions were very much like they are now. People were frustrated. They had 2 years of Clinton. They were scared to death for what they saw, and the Republicans went back in there, and virtually every one of those guys signed on for term limits. They made a term limit pledge. That was 8 terms ago, and almost all of them limited themselves to 5 terms. You know how many of them are still there? Almost all of them.